The sound of the plate hitting the tile was small, but in that house, small things never stayed small. The moment the edge of the dish cracked against the floor, the air thickened as if it knew what would follow. I froze with my hands still wet from the sink water dripping onto the floor. My stepdad's boots thudded against the wood as he walked in. Douglas Quinn. That sound alone could twist my stomach into knots. His voice followed sharp and loud, cutting through the kitchen like the snap of a belt. "Shut up." It wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict. The muscles in my ribs tightened before he even touched me, like my body already knew what came next. He stood close enough that I could smell the grease on his jacket, the scent of stale tobacco that always clung to him. My mom stood in the doorway, arms folded, the corner of her mouth lifting into something that was not quite a smile. It wasn't kind. It was the look she wore when she wanted to make sure I knew my place. I bent to pick up the broken plate. A sharp pain rushed across my side, a twinge I had been ignoring for days from carrying boxes in the basement. The sound of ceramic scraping on tile made everything louder in my head. He moved before I even straightened up. One sudden motion. A brutal shove of his foot into my ribs. Heat shot through my side like a flare. The air left my lungs. My knees gave out, but my hand gripped the counter to keep from collapsing. I tried to breathe, but the air caught halfway, turning into something jagged. My vision blurred at the edges. I didn't scream. Screaming only made it worse in that house. I stared down at the pieces of the broken plate scattered across the floor, white edges shining in the kitchen light. My mom's laugh cut through the pounding in my ears. It was soft, almost musical. If you didn't know better, you would think it was harmless. But I knew it well. It was the sound of her choosing him over me again. I wanted to ask her why she never stopped him, why she always stood there like it was a performance, and she was the silent audience. But my mouth wouldn't open. The pain wrapped around my ribs like a tightening band, pulling tighter each second. My breath came in short bursts. He was still towering over me, shoulders broad, face red, breathing hard, like he'd just finished proving something. He turned away as if it was nothing, as if what just happened was part of the furniture in that house. My hands shook against the counter. The kitchen light above me flickered, buzzing softly, and for a second I hated how ordinary everything looked. Ordinary room. Ordinary night. And yet I was standing here holding my side, feeling like my body didn't belong to me. Outside, rain tapped against the window. The house smelled like detergent and cheap cologne. My mom leaned her shoulder against the doorframe, looking at me the way someone looks at a cracked cup they might throw away. Her laugh faded into a small breath. She didn't ask if I was hurt. She never did. She only watched quiet like it was some show she had paid for long ago. My pulse thumped in my ears. I tasted metal at the back of my throat. The kitchen clock ticked too loud. I forced one slow breath, then another, but each inhale sent a stabbing ache through my side. It wasn't just pain. It was the feeling of being trapped in a place where my voice didn't matter. And then the sound. The doorbell. One clear chime that cut through the stale air. Douglas stiffened. My mom turned her head. The porch light cast a thin line under the front door. Then came the voice from outside, calm but firm. Dr. Evans. He lived 2 houses away. He was the kind of neighbor who noticed things. When the door opened, the cold night air spilled in, carrying the scent of wet asphalt. He stepped inside, wearing his navy jacket shaking off the rain. His eyes scanned the room and then stopped on me. It wasn't hard to see. I was holding my side face, pale breath uneven. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't pity. It was something sharper. Awareness. He spoke once steady. Ember. My name in his voice sounded different. Not like a command, like someone acknowledging a person. Douglas started to mutter something under his breath, but Dr. Evans ignored him completely. He stepped closer, his gaze steady on my face, on the way I was gripping the counter just to stay upright. My mom's smirk faltered for the first time that night. The air in the kitchen changed. It was still heavy, but not just with fear anymore. Something else was pushing against it, witnessing. I knew in that moment that someone had finally seen what this house really was. If someone saw your pain, would they speak up or look away? 6 months before that night, I was standing behind the counter of a small coffee shop in Portland, staring at the closed sign that no longer felt temporary. They had laid off half the staff that week. I was in the other half. It was the kind of quiet that didn't echo, it just sat on your chest. I had no backup plan, only a partial scholarship and a stack of tuition bills that didn't care about timing. I remember holding the last check in my hand, the ink still fresh, knowing it wasn't enough. 2 weeks later, I packed up the little apartment I loved and drove down to Salem. My mom's voice over the phone had sounded sweet, careful, almost rehearsed. "It'll be good to have you back for a while," she'd said. But when I pulled up to the house, Douglas was the one waiting at the door. He didn't smile. He never did. He looked at me like someone measuring lumber for a job, calculating what could be used and what couldn't. Inside, the air smelled like paint and old wood. It wasn't my home anymore. It was his. He was a former construction foreman, the kind of man who gave orders with his chest out. Everything about him felt like rules. The first week back, the control didn't look like control. He asked what time I planned to be home. He suggested I keep my room door unlocked in case someone needed something. He laughed when I hesitated. He didn't have to say much. I could feel the unspoken lines being drawn. My mom's smile that first night was small and tight, the way someone smiles when they want to avoid making a choice. The second week, the questions turned to statements. He started checking if I was in by 9 every night. He'd knock on my door if the lights were on past 10. One afternoon, when I left my phone on the counter, he picked it up and scrolled through it like it belonged to him. I remember standing there frozen, trying to decide if saying something would make it worse. My mom stood at the sink, drying dishes. She didn't stop him. She didn't even look at me. I told myself it wasn't worth a fight. I needed a roof over my head. I needed time to find work again. So I stayed quiet. It's funny how control doesn't feel like control at first. It feels like inconvenience. But then inconvenience becomes routine, and routine becomes a cage. A month in, he started leaving lists on the fridge every morning. Chores, not requests. He would underline certain words. Vacuum, wash, fix, scrub. If something wasn't done right, he'd make a comment about how adults pull their weight. My mom never left notes. She didn't need to. She nodded along with everything he said. I remember one night early October when I came home late from a tutoring job interview. I was 5 minutes past his curfew. He didn't yell. He stood by the kitchen door and stared at the clock like the sound of it ticking was my fault. My mom was on the couch with a book, but she wasn't reading. She was waiting for me to say sorry. I did. Not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to survive the night quietly. That was the night I understood this wasn't a temporary stop. This house was a storm waiting to happen. Over the next weeks, the walls seemed to shrink around me. I learned the exact sound of his boots when he walked down the hall. I learned the difference between silence and the silence that meant trouble was close. He would walk past my room and pause just long enough to remind me who owned the hallway. He made comments about how girls my age needed discipline, about how Portland had made me soft. Sometimes he laughed after he said those things like it was a joke. But nothing about it was funny. I started adjusting myself to him without realizing it. I kept my phone in my pocket. I turned off my lights earlier. I stopped inviting anyone over. Salem felt smaller than I remembered, like every road led back to his front porch. I applied for job after job, but nothing stuck. When the bills came, I folded them and slid them into my drawer, pretending they didn't exist. He knew I was stuck. I think he liked it. The house belonged to him, the rules belonged to him, and somewhere along the line, my voice disappeared. My mom would say small things sometimes like he means well or he just wants structure. Those words made my stomach turn because structure was just another name for control. Each day blurred into the next quiet, stiff, predictable. And then came the little things that shouldn't have mattered but did. How he told me what time I should wake up. How he commented on what I wore when I went out. How he opened the curtains in my room without asking. I stopped pushing back. I convinced myself that silence was safer, that I could endure it until I saved enough to leave. But silence is a dangerous thing. It doesn't keep you safe. It only makes the cage quieter. 6 months before the plate shattered on the kitchen floor, I had already started disappearing in that house. Not all at once, but piece by piece. My breath got smaller, my steps got softer, I smiled less, and Douglas got louder. Mornings in that house always felt like drills. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that pressed down on you before the day even began. Douglas sat at the head of the kitchen table with the newspaper folded neatly in half, like a man who believed every square inch of the room belonged to him. My mom stood by the counter, not reading, not cooking, just waiting for his words. I sat across from him with a bowl of oatmeal I didn't even want. He didn't talk at first. He watched. He had a way of staring that made something as simple as lifting a spoon feel like walking a tightrope. He tilted his head slightly and tapped the table with one finger. "You always eat like that?" he asked. My spoon froze halfway to my mouth. I didn't know what part he meant. My hand, my pace, my existence. He leaned forward, just enough for his chair to creak, and said it again slower, like my silence was a flaw. "You always eat like that." My mom exhaled through her nose. Not a laugh, not a protest, just a quiet surrender that said this was normal now. I lowered the spoon and stared at the oatmeal, feeling heat rise in my face even though the room was cold. The clock ticked above the fridge, and that sound was the only thing that moved. He picked up his coffee, took a long sip, and muttered something about how living in his house meant having standards. That word hung in the air long after he put the cup down. Standards. It sounded clean, but it was really just another chain. After breakfast, he listed chores like orders on a job site. Mop the kitchen, wipe the windows, vacuum, clean the bathroom floor. No, please. No, thank you. My mom added, "And don't forget the garage." Her voice didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to the space he carved around her. By noon, my hands were raw from scrubbing and the house smelled like bleach. He never lifted a finger. He sat in his chair like a general calling out small corrections while my mom nodded along as if these commands were scripture. When I hesitated at one corner of the living room, he said, "If you have time to think, you have time to work." I hated that sentence. It stuck to the walls. By evening, my back ached from bending, but it didn't matter. He walked through the house, inspecting every surface with that look, the one that said he was waiting for failure. My mom trailed behind him, hands folded in front of her like a shadow without a voice. That night, just when I thought I could hide in my room, he called my name. The garage door was already open when I got there. It smelled like oil and cold air. He stood with his hands on his hips and said, "Go through every corner. Wipe everything. I want it clean enough to eat off the floor." I stared at him tired enough that my fingers twitched. He narrowed his eyes like even my breathing was out of line. My mom appeared at the door behind him. She didn't say a word. She didn't even blink. I started cleaning. The concrete floor was cold against my knees. My wrists burned with every swipe. He didn't move to help. He stood and watched as if this humiliation was some kind of lesson. My mom eventually walked away, but she didn't turn back once. That was the moment something cracked inside me. Not loud, quiet, like a whisper no one could hear but me. She wasn't my shield anymore. She hadn't been for a long time, and I was only just admitting it. I remembered how she used to brush my hair when I was little, how her hands used to feel warm. Now they just clutched a dish towel while she stood behind him. Every time I tried to catch her eye to ask without words for something, anything, she looked away. One night I tried saying something small. "Mom, I can't do this all alone." My voice barely made it out. She didn't answer. She pretended she didn't hear me, and in that silence was her choice. She picked him. I kept telling myself to keep my head down, that once I found a job, I'd leave, that this was temporary, but every day felt heavier. Every corner of that house was claimed by him. The garage, the kitchen, the hallways, even the way I ate breakfast. It wasn't just control anymore. It was ownership, and I was the thing being owned. I lay awake at night listening to the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs, counting the seconds between his footsteps. I started dreaming about escape in quiet flashes like a movie without sound. A bus station, a small room somewhere far from Salem, a life that didn't have his voice in it. But then morning came and the routine returned. My hands touched the same mop. My knees hit the same floor, His voice filled the same rooms, and my mom stayed silent. Every little thing built a wall higher than the day before. By then, the pressure wasn't just around me. It was inside me, tight, heavy, growing, and no one else could hear it. The morning of Douglas's birthday started the way every day in that house did, with silence that didn't feel quiet. The air was sharp with the smell of bleach and roast seasoning because I had already been up for 3 hours cleaning the kitchen for his party. He called it a celebration. I called it a performance. He sat in the living room with his feet on the table, barking small corrections through the wall like a foreman on a job site. My mom moved between the counters and the pantry, not talking to me, not helping either. When I carried the first box of party supplies in from the garage, a dull ache flared across my ribs. It had started a few days earlier when I lifted a stack of chairs wrong, but I hadn't said anything. Pain was treated like drama in this house. If you said you hurt, you just gave him more to mock. So I bit down on it like I always did. The second box was heavier. Halfway through setting it down, something pinched hard in my side, like a wire tightening from the inside. I gasped without meaning to. My mom glanced up from arranging napkins but didn't say a word. Douglas smirked from the armchair and said something about me being slow. The clock above the kitchen door ticked louder than it should have. I kept moving. By late afternoon, every surface shone, every dish was set, every corner of the house smelled like the version of clean he liked. My back ached, and the pain in my ribs had sharpened into something solid. He didn't lift a finger. He sat there with a beer in his hand, watching me move like I was a worker he'd hired. When I finally stood still trying to catch my breath, he snapped his fingers at a speck of dust I couldn't even see. My mom laughed lightly the way someone does when they want to stay out of the blast zone. Guests started arriving around 6. The house filled with a soft hum of polite conversation. Neighbors! A couple of his old work buddies. No one looked at me except when I carried trays past them. That was my role. Silent hands. Background noise. My ribs throbbed every time I reached forward. I kept my left arm pressed close to my side, trying to make it less obvious. By the time the last dish went on the table, my breathing had turned shallow. My mom brushed past me in the hallway, her perfume mixing with the smell of roast. I whispered, "I don't feel right." She kept walking. That was my answer. When the sky outside turned dark, the house lights felt too bright. The noise from the living room blurred into one dull roar. I was in the kitchen stacking plates when it happened. I dropped a glass. It hit the floor and cracked clean down the middle. The sound cut through everything. Douglas's voice followed like a hammer. "Shut up!" He rose from the chair, beer still in hand, walking toward me slow. I stood frozen near the counter, one hand over my ribs. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't care. His eyes narrowed like he was looking at a stain. He took one step closer and kicked hard into my side. I didn't see it coming. The pain was bright white, blinding. It knocked the air out of me before I could make a sound. I stumbled against the counterhands, scrambling for balance. The floor tilted. My lungs refused to open. I tried to straighten, but every movement sent fire up my side. Behind him, my mom laughed. A small sound, almost pretty, but it wasn't soft. It was sharp and cruel. It was the sound of someone who had already chosen a side. The betrayal wasn't new, but this time it landed different. This time it carved itself into bone. My knees buckled and I slid against the cabinet, the cold surface pressing into my back as if to remind me I was still here, still trapped. He stood over me like nothing had happened, like I was the mess, not him. His voice came again, low and controlled. "Pick it up." I couldn't. I barely breathed. The room dimmed around the edges. I heard the party noise outside the kitchen, the soft laughter of people who didn't see who didn't want to. Then came the sound I didn't expect. The doorbell, one clear chime. Douglas stiffened. My mom's face twitched. The porch light threw a thin line of brightness across the entryway. A few seconds later, Dr. Evans's voice came through the door. Calm, direct. The kind of voice that doesn't ask permission. My mom tried to smooth her hair. Douglas muttered under his breath. When the door opened, the cold night rushed in like it belonged more in that house than we did. Dr. Evans stepped inside, shaking rain from his jacket, his eyes scanning the room like he already knew something was wrong. And then he saw me. I was holding my side face pale, breathing in shallow gulps, my back still pressed against the cabinet. For a moment, the room went completely silent. His gaze locked on mine, and I saw the recognition in it. Not confusion, not pity. Recognition! My mom froze in the doorway, her smirk dying in her throat. Douglas turned toward him like a wall trying to block the view, but it was too late. Someone had seen. Dr. Evans stepped forward, the light from the porch spilling across the kitchen floor, cutting the shadows between us. I wanted to speak to explain, but all that came out was air. So I looked at him, not pleading, just hoping that this time someone wouldn't pretend not to see. Dr. Evans didn't ask questions the way most people do when they're not sure what they're seeing. He moved like a man who already knew exactly what was wrong. His eyes swept over me, lingering on the way. My hand gripped my side, the uneven rise and fall of my chest. "She's hurt," he said flatly, not a trace of hesitation in his voice. Douglas let out a sharp laugh, the kind that wasn't amusement but warning. "She's fine," he snapped. "She's just putting on a show." My mom's hands fluttered uselessly near the kitchen counter. She looked like someone caught between wanting to disappear and wanting to control the narrative. Dr. Evans ignored both of them. He crouched down next to me, careful not to startle me. "Ember, I need you to breathe slow," he said, and his voice was so steady it cut through the static in my head. I tried to do what he said, but each breath felt like a knife pressing deeper. His jaw tightened. He didn't waste time. He straightened and pulled his phone from his pocket. Douglas's voice sharpened. "Don't you dare call anyone!" Dr. Evans met his glare without blinking. "If you put your hands on her again or block me from calling for help, I'll make sure the police are here with the ambulance." Something in his tone made the room go still. My mom stepped back, her mouth opening and closing without sound. He spoke into the phone, clearly giving our address, describing my condition, his voice crisp and professional. "Female 22, difficulty breathing, suspected rib fracture. Possible assault." Those last two words hung heavy in the air. Douglas muttered under his breath, pacing near the table, trying to look like the one in control. He wasn't anymore. I could see it in the way his hands fidgeted at his sides. My mom was frozen in place, pale under the kitchen light. She wasn't thinking about me. She was thinking about the neighbors, about how this would look. The sound of the approaching siren cracked the silence like thunder. Douglas swore quietly. Dr. Evans moved closer to me again, keeping his voice low this time. "You're going to be okay. They'll get you out of here soon." I didn't know how to answer. All I felt was the raw pulse of pain in my ribs, and something else underneath it, relief, the first sliver of it I'd felt in months. The door burst open, and two EMTs stepped in their jackets, damp from the rain, their faces focused. One of them knelt beside me, asking questions in a calm, practiced rhythm. "Name, age, where does it hurt? Can you breathe?" Their hands were firm but careful as they checked my breathing, the way my ribs moved. One of them glanced up at Dr. Evans, and something passed between them without words. "We need to get her to the ER," the EMT said. Douglas barked. "She doesn't need a damn hospital. She's exaggerating. Always has been." The EMT didn't look at him. "Sir, step back." Douglas didn't move. Dr. Evans stepped between them, his shoulders squared, and for a moment the house felt less like his and more like neutral ground. "She's leaving," he said simply. My mom finally spoke, her voice thin and shaky. "People will talk." Dr. Evans turned to her, and his voice cut like steel. "Better they talk now than read about a tragedy later." My mom didn't respond. The EMTs slid their hands under my arms, carefully lifting me to a sitting position. The movement sent a sharp wave of pain through my side, so intense I bit down on my lip to keep from crying out. They eased me onto the stretcher, strapping me in gently. Douglas stood rigid near the hallway, his jaw clenched, his face red with a mix of anger and something like fear. My mom followed the stretcher to the door, but stopped short when she saw the flashing lights outside. Rain fell in thin needles glinting in the red and white lights. As they rolled me toward the ambulance, the cold air hit my face, clearing the fog in my head for just a second. I caught a glimpse of the house behind me, Douglas in the doorway, my mom half hidden in the shadows. The door looked like the mouth of something that had almost swallowed me whole, and for the first time in a long time, I was being pulled away from it. Inside the ambulance, the EMT clipped a pulse oximeter to my finger and adjusted the straps. The other checked my breathing, pressing gently against my ribs. I winced and sucked in air through my teeth. "Fractures likely," she said to her partner. "Breathing's shallow. Let's keep her stable until we get to Salem Hospital." She turned to me. "You're safe here, okay?" It was such a simple sentence, but it caught in my chest. No one had said that to me in years. I nodded weakly, my fingers clutching the edge of the blanket they had thrown over me. Through the small rear window, I saw Dr. Evans standing in the rain, arms crossed, watching as the ambulance doors closed. It was the last image I saw of the house. The engine rumbled to life. The siren rose, and the world outside blurred into streaks of light. I focused on the rhythm of the siren, the steady hands of the EMT, and the oxygen mask against my face. My chest still burned with every breath, but underneath the pain was something quieter, a flicker of safety. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and sharp light. The EMTs wheeled me through the sliding doors and into the bright hallway. Nurses moved quickly around us, asking questions, taking notes, wrapping a blood pressure cuff around my arm. A doctor with tired eyes but steady hands asked me where it hurt most. I told her, my voice catching halfway through. They moved me to an exam bay, drew the curtain, and started checking everything. One nurse pressed gently along my ribs, and I felt the exact point where pain shot like a blade. She nodded slightly. "There," she murmured. The doctor ordered imaging right away. X-rays. They lifted me carefully onto a narrow table, the machine humming above me. The ceiling tiles blurred into one gray mass as I tried to stay still. When they moved me back to the bed, the room felt colder than it had before. Dr. Simmons introduced herself in a voice that was calm but firm. "You have at least one fractured rib," she said. "There's some swelling and possibly a small hemothorax. We're admitting you for monitoring." I stared at the monitor next to me, its soft beeping steady like a heartbeat. She crouched slightly, meeting my eyes. "Ember, do you feel safe where you live?" The question hit me harder than the diagnosis. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out at first. I didn't need to explain the whole house to her. She could already see it in the bruises, in the way my body flinched when anyone raised their voice, in the way I answered questions like someone waiting to be punished. I whispered, "No." She nodded once. "Okay. Then we're going to call the police, and we'll make sure someone talks to you about protection orders and support. You're not going back there tonight." She didn't ask permission. She didn't hesitate. A nurse placed an IV in my arm, and warm fluid rushed through me. Another adjusted the oxygen. I felt the cold draft of the curtain as it shifted. Moments later, a uniformed officer stepped in. "Officer Cole." He introduced himself, but my mind was half fog. He spoke gently, asking simple questions about what happened. I told him everything in broken sentences. The glass, the words, the kick, the laughter, Dr. Evans's voice, the sirens. He wrote everything down his pen, scratching softly against the pad. "We'll open an investigation," he said when I finished, "and we'll keep you safe." He wasn't the first person to say those words to someone, but he was the first to say them to me. I nodded, feeling the exhaustion crawl over me like a heavy blanket. He left after a few minutes, promising to return the next day. The nurse dimmed the light above me, and for the first time in months, the night didn't feel like it belonged to Douglas. My ribs still hurt with every breath, but that pain was mine now, not something he owned. Outside the curtain, I could hear the steady rhythm of hospital life. Machines, footsteps, voices that didn't belong to him. I closed my eyes and let the sound wrap around me. For once, pain didn't mean silence. It meant proof. Proof someone believed me. Proof someone finally saw. Morning light leaked in through the narrow hospital window like it wasn't supposed to be there. It was soft, cold, almost hesitant, but it was still more gentle than anything I had woken up to in that house. The monitors hummed their quiet rhythm beside me, and my ribs ached with every breath. It wasn't the sharp agony of the night before anymore. It was a steady reminder, a bruise with a pulse. When the curtain slid open, Officer Raymond Cole stepped in with a notebook in one hand and a look that didn't try to hide the weight of what he'd been told. He introduced himself quietly, like he understood what fragile sounded like. His badge caught a flash of the overhead light as he pulled up a chair. "Ember, I know this isn't easy," he said, voice even, "but I need to hear everything from you, as much as you can give me." His tone didn't have that distant politeness people use when they're just checking boxes. It had the kind of firmness that means he's done this before, that he knows the shape of stories like mine. My hands trembled under the thin hospital blanket. I stared at the edge of it, then took a breath and forced myself to start. I told him about the glass shattering on the kitchen floor, about Douglas's voice, about the kick, about the way my mother laughed. The words came out uneven at first, too quiet, but they built their own rhythm the longer I spoke. I told him about the pain in my ribs, the nights of silence, the control that started long before the first bruise. I told him how Dr. Evans found me hunched over, barely breathing. At some point my throat tightened and tears slipped down without asking permission, but I didn't stop talking. This was the first time the words weren't just sitting in my chest rotting. They were out. Officer Cole nodded slowly, taking notes with clean, deliberate strokes. He didn't interrupt, didn't shift uncomfortably. He let me build the record piece by piece. When I finished, I felt hollow and shaky, like I had poured everything into the air and it hadn't landed yet. He clicked his pen closed. "Thank you," he said simply. Like what I did mattered. Dr. Evans arrived a few minutes later. He was still in his work jacket, hair damp from the morning rain. He greeted Officer Cole with the familiarity of two men who'd crossed paths before. Then he turned to me, his eyes scanning my face in a way that wasn't invasive. It was steady anchoring. "Tell him exactly what you saw," Officer Cole said. And Dr. Evans did. He described walking in, seeing me doubled over, hearing my breathing, seeing the way I held my side. He described the tension in the room, the way Douglas and my mother reacted. He didn't add, drama, didn't guess, just facts. But those facts landed like bricks. They built a structure around my words, something real enough for the law to hold on to. Officer Cole finished writing and asked him to sign a witness statement, which he did without hesitation. When he turned back to me, his voice softened. "You did the right thing letting us take you out of there," he said. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the first time anyone had said it out loud. A nurse came in to check my vitals, and when she left, Officer Cole explained what would happen next. There would be an official investigation. A protective order could be issued. Charges could follow, depending on the medical documentation and witness statements. He told me my words mattered, and for the first time, I almost believed him. Later that afternoon, Dr. Evans returned with someone I hadn't met. A woman in a dark green blazer, her hair tied neatly back. She extended her hand to me with a firm grip. "Cynthia Price," she said. "I'm a lawyer." Harold filled me in. "If you want, I'll handle your case pro bono." I blinked at her, unsure what to say. She smiled, not the soft kind that bends, but the kind that stands. "You don't owe me anything. We just make sure people like him don't get to keep control." There was something so simple and solid about the way she said it that it made something in me unclench. We sat together, the three of us, while she explained how the legal process worked in Oregon. She talked about statements, protective orders, the timeline for pressing charges. She talked about what power looked like when it shifted back into your own hands. She didn't promise it would be easy. She promised it would be real. While all this was happening, my phone buzzed once. A single text from my mom. "Are you really doing this?" I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering. Then I put the phone face down on the tray table. She hadn't visited. She hadn't called the hospital. The only message I got was a question that sounded more like an accusation. It wasn't a surprise. She'd made her choice the second she stood in that kitchen and let him hurt me. Cynthia leaned forward slightly. "You don't owe them silence," she said, "and you're not alone in this anymore." It felt strange hearing those words, like they were too big to fit inside me, but something in me reached for them anyway. Officer Cole returned with a clipboard of documents. His tone was professional, but not cold. "This is a formal statement of complaint," he said. "Signing it means you're officially asking for an investigation and charges. It also opens the door to a restraining order. I stared at the line where my name would go. My hand shook slightly as I picked up the pen. I thought about the house, the garage, the sound of Douglas's boots, the way my mother's eyes looked when she pretended I didn't exist. I thought about the years I told myself I could endure it, and I thought about the way Dr. Evans's voice sounded when he said my name like it belonged to me. My fingers tightened. The pen touched paper. I signed. The sound of the pen scratching across the form was louder in my head than the sirens the night before. Officer Cole nodded once and slipped the papers into his folder. Cynthia reached out and squeezed my hand. That was the hardest part, she said quietly. Now it's documented, and documented means real. I exhaled slowly. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something quieter, like air moving in a space that had been locked for too long. Dr. Evans stepped closer to the bed, resting one hand on the rail. "He doesn't get to write the story anymore," he said. And for a moment, the weight in my chest didn't feel like it was crushing me. It felt like it was shifting. As the day faded into evening, the hospital lights dimmed in the hallway. Cynthia went over more details about the upcoming process interviews, protective orders, the timeline of hearings. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had walked this road beside other people before. She told me there would be moments when it would feel unbearable. That was part of how people like Douglas tried to win. But she also said something else. The truth has its own weight, she said, and once it's out, it doesn't go back into the dark. After she left, I lay in bed staring at the soft glow of the monitor beside me. Outside the window, the rain had started again, tapping against the glass in uneven rhythms. I thought about my mom, probably still in that house, worrying more about what the neighbors would say than about the bruise spreading under my ribs. I thought about Douglas pacing the hallway, realizing for the first time that something had slipped out of his hands. And then, I thought about the folder Officer Cole carried with my signature inside it. A piece of paper that meant he couldn't pretend anymore. That no one could. My chest hurt when I breathed, but it didn't feel the same as before. The pain wasn't silence now. It was evidence. And evidence meant something bigger than fear. Would you stay silent or sign the papers that change everything? The courthouse smelled like polished wood and cold air, a mix that felt too clean for the kind of truth we were about to drag into it. The stone steps of Marion County Courthouse were slick with early spring rain as I climbed them, my ribs still tender under the layers of fabric I'd carefully chosen. Not because I wanted to look good, because I wanted to look like I belonged here. I wanted him to see that I hadn't disappeared like he wanted me to. Inside, the hall echoed with soft footsteps and the low murmur of voices. Courtrooms have a kind of quiet that isn't really quiet at all. It's waiting. I sat next to Cynthia at the table reserved for victims and witnesses. Her pen tapped once against the file in front of her, steady and unshaken. Across the room, Douglas sat at the defense table in a pressed shirt he never would have worn at home. His jaw was clenched tight, his hands locked together on the surface of the table. He didn't look at me, not directly, but I could feel it. That heat, that old ownership he thought he still had. My mom sat behind him in the gallery, her purse clutched tight in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor like if she didn't look up, none of this would be real. She hadn't visited me once since the night of the ambulance. Not once. The bailiff called everyone to order and the judge entered. The scrape of chairs against the floor was loud enough to make me flinch. I straightened my shoulders, ignoring the dull pull in my ribs. The prosecution began with their opening statement. Calm, unemotional. They laid out the timeline the way you lay out blueprints, piece by piece, foundation first. The sound of glass breaking, the command, the kick, the laugh, the 911 call, the EMT report, the x-rays. My silence turned into evidence. Every time they said my name, it didn't sound small. It sounded official, real. The defense tried to paint it as a misunderstanding, a family disagreement blown out of proportion, but the prosecutor's voice didn't waver. She reminded the court that I left that house with fractured ribs, that Douglas had a history of verbal aggression documented by neighbors who'd overheard shouting, that my mother's silence was not proof of my guilt, but of his control. Then came the testimony. Dr. Evans walked to the stand wearing his work jacket over a collared shirt, his hair damp from the same rain I'd walked through. He raised his hand and swore in. His voice when he spoke was clear, steady, the same voice that cut through that kitchen air the night everything broke. He described exactly what he saw. How I was hunched against the counter, unable to breathe. How Douglas tried to block the situation. How my mother did nothing. How he called 911. Bien, because I clearly couldn't. The defense tried to shake him, asking why he didn't intervene sooner, why he hadn't stepped in earlier if he'd been concerned. He met the lawyer's questions with that unblinking steadiness. Because that was the moment I realized she might not survive another night in that house, he said. It landed like a weight. The defense attorney shifted his papers like maybe the movement would fill the silence, but nothing did. The EMT who had helped me that night took the stand next. She described my breathing, the bruising, my pain level, her medical assessment of the injury. Then the prosecutor displayed the x-rays on a monitor for the court to see. The clean white line of my ribs and the dark fracture cutting through it glowed like proof that couldn't be twisted. The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the projector. The prosecutor's voice lowered when she spoke again. This is what "she's fine" looks like. The defense lawyer didn't look at the images for long. Douglas kept his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle flicker. My mom's shoulders hunched further forward. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "What we have here isn't a family misunderstanding," she said. "It's years of control, years of silence. And finally, one night when the truth was too loud to ignore, she asked me to take the stand. My legs felt shaky as I stood, but Cynthia's hand on my arm was solid. The bailiff swore me in. The wood of the witness chair was colder than I expected. The courtroom blurred for a moment as I looked across it. Douglas's face was tight, his eyes like a wall. My mom wouldn't meet my gaze. I stared at the prosecutor instead because looking anywhere else felt like drowning. I told the court about that night, about the plate, the words, the pain. I told them how my mother laughed while I struggled to stand. I told them about the sound of Dr. Evans's voice cutting through the air, about the relief of the sirens. The prosecutor's questions were gentle measured. The defense tried to paint me as dramatic, too emotional, but every question they asked, I answered with the truth. And the truth didn't bend. When they asked why I didn't leave earlier, why I didn't call for help before I looked straight at the jury and said, "Because sometimes you learn to make yourself small just to survive. And sometimes it takes one person seeing you to remember you exist." A murmur rippled faintly through the gallery. Then the prosecutor did something simple. She read my statement aloud, word for word, including the moment Douglas said, "Shut up." She let those two words hang in the air long enough for everyone in the room to feel the weight of them. That was the sound that broke me open. That was the sound that changed everything. I watched my mother's head dip lower like she could hide from the echo of it. She couldn't. The courtroom was still. Even the judge sat back slightly, his eyes fixed on Douglas. When the prosecutor rested, there wasn't much left for the defense to build with. They tried to soften his actions, to talk about stress, to talk about misunderstandings. But the facts stood where their excuses crumbled. The EMT report, the x-rays, the photographs of the bruising, the recorded statement, Dr. Evans's testimony, my words. There was no misunderstanding left. The judge delivered the verdict in a voice that carried through the entire room. Guilty of assault in the second degree, a 5-year restraining order, mandatory counseling, a fine covering medical costs and legal fees, and a criminal record that would follow him long after the courthouse emptied. The bailiff stepped forward as Douglas was handcuffed. His head snapped toward me for the first time since the trial began. His eyes were full of a rage that no longer had a home to return to. I met his gaze without blinking. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because fear didn't belong to him anymore. My mom made a sound when the cuffs clicked. A small, broken sound that was half gasp, half sob. She covered her mouth like she was the victim in a tragedy she helped build. I didn't look at her again. Reporters stood outside the courthouse steps waiting. I didn't give a statement. I walked past them with Cynthia on one side and Dr. Evans on the other. But I saw the headlines the next morning. Local man convicted of domestic assault. Victim sustained fractured ribs. Witnesses confirm long-term control. His name was printed in bold. Mine wasn't. I liked it that way. The neighbors who used to look away when they heard shouting through the windows started looking at me differently after that. Not pity, exactly. Recognition. People whispered, but they whispered the truth now. He couldn't rewrite it anymore. He couldn't make me small again. When I lay in bed that night, the courthouse lights still echoing in my head, I didn't feel victorious. I felt clean, like a wound that had finally been washed out. It still hurt, but it was no longer festering in the dark. That was the thing about exposure. It burned, but it also lit the way out. 2 months after the courthouse went silent and the rain finally lifted from Salem, my phone rang on a gray afternoon. I almost didn't pick it up. The number wasn't saved, but it was too familiar to ignore. My mother's voice bled through the speaker, thin and trembling like a loose thread. Ember, she whispered, like saying my name too loudly might make everything more real. There was no hello. No, how are you? Just my name. I closed my laptop slowly, the quiet hum of the coffee shop around me fading into background static. She hadn't called me once after the verdict, not on my birthday, not the night they led Douglas out of that courtroom in handcuffs, not when the newspaper stories ran, but now she did. He's not doing well, she said. Her voice carried that same quiver it always did when she wanted something. Prison isn't where he belongs. He made a mistake. He's sorry. The word sorry sounded brittle on her tongue. It wasn't hers. It was his. I didn't say anything. The silence stretched long enough that she rushed to fill it. If you asked the judge to reconsider, if you told them he wasn't dangerous, they might reduce the sentence. Her breath hitched like she was already rehearsing my yes. He's still your stepfather, Ember. He took care of us. He kept a roof over our heads. The memory of that house rose in my chest like something sour. The roof that felt like a cage. The kitchen air that smelled like fear. Her laughter the night he kicked me hard enough to crack bone. No, I said. Just one word. Flat? Cold? The kind of no that doesn't need repeating. She stumbled over the next sentence like she hadn't prepared for that. You don't mean that, she said. You can't just turn your back on family. I let out a soft, humorless breath. I learned that from you. The line went quiet. I could almost hear the way she flinched at that. Then her voice turned sharp at the edges. Do you know what's happening to me? They took the house. His pension's frozen. The bank's coming after me. I don't have anywhere to go. It was strange how she could make every disaster sound like my fault, even when she built it with her silence. That's not on me, I said softly. That's on him, and on you for standing next to him while he did what he did. She started crying, then the messy kind she used when I was little to make me fold. It used to work. It didn't anymore. Ember, please. He's all I have. I stared out the window at the drizzle smudging the Portland skyline, at the pale gray light breaking over the Willamette River. And you made your choice, I whispered. Then I ended the call. For a long time, I sat there letting the weight of her voice settle, not like a knife this time, but like distant thunder. I wasn't that girl in the kitchen anymore, choking on someone else's power. I was living in a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Portland, working nights at a bookstore and slowly clawing my way back into classes. My ribs still ached sometimes when the weather turned cold, but I learned to live with the ache. It was mine now, not his. Word about Douglas's conviction spread further than I expected. He wasn't a powerful man, not really, but in a town like Salem, reputation is currency. And his had burned. Contractors who once shook his hand now crossed the street to avoid him. His name showed up in local articles about domestic violence sentencing. 5 years. Assault in the 2nd degree. His world had shrunk to a few walls and a cot. He tried to reclaim it, though. A letter arrived 2 weeks after my mother's call. It came in a plain envelope, no return address except a prison facility stamp. My name on the front looked wrong in his handwriting, like the letters themselves didn't want to belong to him anymore. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. His words were neat rehearsed, as if he'd practiced them over and over on the inside. He said he was sorry. He said he was different now. He said prison had given him time to think. He said he missed me. He said I'd ruined him, but he understood. It was the strangest kind of manipulation, half apology, half threat, woven under the surface. He wrote that he still remembered the way I used to come home from school, the way my mother laughed when we watched TV together. He tried to paint our life like it was soft, like he hadn't spent years sharpening the edges of it. He ended with a line that made my stomach go cold. "Family forgives Ember. I know you will too." I folded the letter once, twice, 3 times. Then I struck a match. The paper curled and blackened in the small metal bowl I used for burning incense. The smoke rose steady and clean. His words turned to ash faster than he expected me to break. That night, I stood by the window watching the streetlight smear gold across the wet pavement and thought about the girl I'd been 2 months earlier, bent over in a kitchen clutching her ribs, choking on silence. I wasn't her anymore. My mother tried to call again a week later. I didn't pick up. She left a voicemail, the kind that starts out angry and ends with begging. I listened once and deleted it. The world didn't fall apart when I didn't answer. It just stayed quiet. My apartment was small, but mine. No slammed doors. No shouted orders. Just the sound of rain against glass and my own breathing. I started keeping fresh flowers on the windowsill even when I couldn't really afford them. They were my reminder that softness didn't belong to him. Life didn't end with a courtroom verdict. It began there. I saw my reflection in the glass that night, my hair tied up messily from work, my face a little tired but steady. There was something in my eyes I hadn't seen in years. A steadiness that didn't ask permission. A voice that didn't shake. Forgiveness was never on the table. He'd taken enough. I didn't owe him the rest. I didn't owe her either. I picked up the bowl of ashes, walked out onto the balcony, and let the wind take them. Tiny gray fragments scattered into the dark sky. The last thing he ever sent me was gone. Would you forgive or finally let go? The folding chairs creaked softly as people settled into the small community center room. The walls were a warm off-white, and the afternoon sun filtered through the high windows, catching tiny motes of dust in its light. The heater hummed low. It wasn't a courtroom, and it wasn't a hospital. It was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that traps you. It was the kind that lets you breathe. I stood near the front of the room, clutching a paper cup of lukewarm tea, trying not to fidget. 2 months ago, I wouldn't have imagined standing here. I wouldn't have imagined walking into a room full of strangers and letting them know the pieces of me that used to feel too small to speak. But today wasn't about hiding. It was about breathing in air that wasn't borrowed from anyone else. Dr. Evans leaned against the wall near the back arms folded loosely, a small, encouraging smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Cynthia sat near the front row, legal pads tucked away for once, wearing a wool sweater instead of a blazer. She caught my eye and gave me a small nod. Just one. But that one nod felt like someone laying down a stepping stone where I didn't think a path existed. The group leader introduced me with a few gentle words about resilience and voice. And then the room fell into that waiting stillness again. Not the heavy silence of fear, the kind that invites you in. I took a slow breath and stepped forward. I used to live in a house where silence was the rule. I began my voice rough at the edges but clear. You didn't raise your voice, you didn't question anything, you didn't cry too loud, you learned to take up less space so you wouldn't set something off. Heads nodded quietly around the room. Women, men, people of different ages, different stories etched in the small lines around their eyes. They didn't need the details to understand. They recognized the shape of it. 6 months ago, I thought that kind of silence was just how life worked, I said. I thought if I kept my head down, if I tried to stay invisible, it would protect me. But it never protected me. It just protected him. My fingers tightened slightly on the paper cup. The sound of rain on the windows that night came back to me in fragments. The cold floor against my knees, my mother's laugh, the weight of his boot against my ribs, and then the sound of Dr. Kerr. Evans's voice cutting through it all like a blade. The night everything changed, someone saw me, I continued. He didn't look away. He didn't ask if it was bad enough. He just acted, and for the first time that house stopped swallowing me whole. A woman in the second row brushed at her eyes. A man in a work jacket leaned forward, elbows on his knees, breathing like he was trying not to make a sound. I didn't rush. I let the weight of the words sit where they landed. I ended up in a hospital bed with a broken rib and a choice. I said. I could keep quiet like I always had, or I could speak up and make sure he couldn't do it again. I chose to speak. I didn't glorify the court process. I told them the truth, that it was terrifying, that it felt like dragging your pain into the light and letting strangers look at it, that hearing the defense try to twist it made my stomach twist with it. But I also told them what it felt like when the judge said the word guilty. When Douglas's name showed up in headlines, when my silence became a matter of record, not a secret. When you're in it, I said softly, you think their power is permanent. But it's not. It's loud. It's cruel. But it breaks. It breaks the second it's forced into the light. A woman in her 50s stood up slowly from the back of the room. She wore a faded denim jacket and her hair was streaked with gray. She walked toward me with steady steps and didn't say anything at first. Then she wrapped her arms around me, not a desperate hug, a steady one. She smelled like peppermint and laundry detergent. "You gave me courage," she whispered. The words landed in my chest like a soft, warm weight. I hugged her back. I didn't have to say anything. Around the room, faces shifted. Some were wet with tears. Some were tight with something fierce. A kind of resolve that doesn't need to be loud to be real. Dr. Evans cleared his throat softly like he was holding something too big in his chest. Cynthia's eyes glistened in the light. They had seen me at my smallest. Now they were here as I stood on my own feet. The group continued after that, other people sharing their stories in voices that trembled and voices that didn't. I listened, really listened to how different and how painfully similar our stories were. Different walls, different faces, the same silence, the same way it cracked open when someone finally said no more. When the meeting ended, the room emptied slowly. People lingering near the door, trading quiet thank yous and "I'm here if you need to talk." The woman in the denim jacket squeezed my hand before leaving. "You're going to change more than you know," she said. Her voice was soft, but certain. Dr. Evans walked me out into the early evening light. The rain had stopped and the pavement outside the community center was still damp, glinting under the street lights. "You did good in there," he said. "I was shaking," I admitted. He chuckled. "Doesn't change the fact that you did it." Cynthia joined us on the sidewalk, slipping her hands into her pockets. "What you said today," she said, "will echo further than you'll ever see." I believed her, not because she was a lawyer, but because she was right. Words don't vanish once they're spoken. They ripple. They land somewhere. That night, after they hugged me goodbye and went their separate ways, I walked alone through downtown Portland. The air smelled like wet concrete and coffee, and the river nearby carried the sound of its slow, steady current. I followed the familiar path to the bridge I'd been crossing since I was a teenager. Back then, it was the place I came to breathe when the house felt too small. Now it was the place I came to remind myself I wasn't there anymore. The bridge stretched over the Willamette like a quiet spine. The lights along its railing glowed soft gold reflected in the black water below. I walked to the center and rested my hands against the cold metal. The wind brushed against my hair, tangling the strands against my cheeks. It smelled like rain and something clean, something alive. I closed my eyes and listened. The city moved around me in distant sounds, tires hissing on wet streets, a faint siren somewhere far off, the sound of someone's laughter on the riverbank. It was the opposite of that kitchen night. Back then, silence was a weight pressing down on my chest, squeezing until I couldn't breathe. Now, silence wasn't empty. It was wide. It belonged to me. I opened my eyes and looked out over the dark water. I thought about Douglas sitting in a cell 200 miles away, about my mother clinging to the ruins of a house that no longer belonged to her, about the girl I had been so small, so convinced that surviving meant staying quiet. She didn't exist anymore. She didn't disappear either. She became the ground I stood on. I thought about the courtroom, about the moment the prosecutor said my name, like it was real, about the sound of that verdict falling into the room like a hammer that didn't just break chains, it announced the break. I thought about the woman who hugged me and whispered that I gave her courage. Courage is contagious. That's what no one tells you when you're trapped. You think your pain is a closed room, but the second you speak, you kick the door open for someone else. I breathed in deep and the air didn't burn. My ribs still ached on cold days. Scars don't care about verdicts. But the ache was mine now, not a sentence someone else wrote for me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Cynthia. "Proud of you today. One from Dr. Evans. You saved more people than you know." I smiled, small and quiet, and slipped the phone away without replying. Some things didn't need words right away. The river carried the wind against my face, cool and clean. For the first time in what felt like years, I let the silence settle around me without fighting it. This wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence after a storm, the kind where you hear your own heartbeat again and realize it was always there, just waiting for space. I tilted my face up to the sky. The clouds had parted just enough for a stretch of late spring sun to spill across the bridge. The light was soft, almost shy, but it found me anyway. It warmed the bruises that had already faded, touched the lines on my face that weren't there before. Not scars. Proof. This time, I whispered to the air, to the river, to the past silence didn't win. And it never would again. If you're still here listening to this, then maybe something inside you felt the weight of what happened to me. Maybe you've been in a room where silence ruled. Maybe you've seen someone shrink so small they almost disappeared. Or maybe you were the one who got smaller just to make it through the day. I know what that feels like. I know what it's like to hold your breath so someone else can have the air. I know the sound of a slammed door, the kind that tells you to stay quiet or pay for it. And I know the way silence can feel like safety until you realize it's the thing keeping you trapped. That's why this story isn't just about me. It's about anyone who's ever been made to believe their pain doesn't count. It's about every person who's sat at a kitchen table pretending the bruise doesn't hurt because they don't think anyone would listen if they said it did. It's about what happens when one person decides silence isn't going to win this time. When Dr. Evans called 911, he didn't know he was doing more than saving a girl with a fractured rib. He was proving something bigger. He was proving that seeing matters, that listening matters, that stepping in can rewrite the ending. That's why I tell this story out loud, not because I like to remember the hurt. I don't. But because someone out there needs to hear it to remember, they can still stand up. Someone out there needs to know their voice can be louder than the fear that's been sitting in their chest for years. Someone needs to know that the story they've been surviving doesn't have to be the story they end with. If this story made you feel something even just a little, I want to ask you something. If you saw someone like me in that kitchen, what would you do? Would you keep walking? Would you pretend you didn't hear? Or would you speak up? Because sometimes it takes one person, just one, to change everything. Sometimes that person isn't the one who's hurt. It's the one who decides not to look away. If you've ever known that kind of silence, or if you're living with it right now, I want you to hear me clearly. Your voice matters. Your pain isn't invisible, and your story doesn't have to stay in the dark. The world wants you to believe justice is too far away, too complicated, too heavy. But justice isn't always about the gavel-hitting wood. Sometimes justice begins with a single word said out loud for the first time. No. Stop. Enough. Sometimes it's signing your name on a page that changes everything. Sometimes it's walking away and not looking back. I know the fear doesn't disappear overnight. I know the scars don't stop aching just because a judge says guilty. I know how loud the past can be when the house finally goes quiet. But I also know what it feels like to stand on a bridge with no one's hands around your throat to breathe and know the air belongs to you. If you've been there, if you've felt that kind of silence, then I hope this story lit a small flame somewhere inside you. A reminder, a warning, a promise. I want you to remember this moment right here, right now, because the story doesn't end with me. It ends when someone else finds their voice too. So tell me something. What would you have done if it was your stepdad? What would you have done if it was your kitchen, your ribs, your silence on the line? Would you walk away, or would you stay and speak? Leave your answer in the comments. Not because I need it, but because someone else scrolling through might. Someone else might see your words and think, maybe I can say something too. And if you're watching this from a quiet room somewhere and wondering if anyone would believe you know this, I believe you. Someone out there would. And it only takes one to make the world tilt back toward justice. If this story spoke to something inside you, like share and subscribe. Not for the numbers, for the ripple. Stories like this are how we make sure silence doesn't keep winning. And tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city and your time zone in the comments below. You'd be surprised how many of us are out there breathing the same air, surviving the same storms, finding the same quiet after. Let this be the space where no one gets to rewrite your truth but you. Let this be the moment someone else finds the courage to stand. The light in this story isn't me. It's the way it travels from one person to another. It's the way it refuses to die. And if you've carried something like this for too long, this is me telling you, silence doesn't get to win anymore. Not yours, not mine, not ever again.